Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Most people would accept that the budget has recognized that there are serious challenges facing the economy. But the key question is, how effectively has the budget responded to them? That's the issue I shall raise today with India's former Chief Statistician, the International Growth Centre's Country Director, and the Chairman of the Standing Committee on Statistics, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, in each case, let me start with the challenge facing the economy before I come to what the budget proposes to do about it. And first, unemployment. The Centre for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that the overall unemployment rate in June was 9.1%. For people between the ages of 15 and 19, it was 58%. For people between 20 and 24, it was 46%. In fact, even out of those who are deemed to be employed, 100 million are said to be unpaid, and that raises the question, what sort of employment is this? So let me start with a simple issue. Do we have a crisis of employment on our hands?
We have an employment problem for sure. Now, whether you term it as a crisis or not depends on where you're coming from. Let me give you, I think, one point of data which I think would put it into perspective. You know, we have had a history of 30-year history of people moving out of agriculture into non-agricultural occupations. And this has been going on, and the proportion of people who are employed in agriculture fell from nearly 70% to 42%. And now, in the last 2 years, it's gone back up to 46%. So it's turned around and gone in the opposite direction. And 4% of the labor force is not a small number. I mean, we are talking about roughly somewhere around 20 to 24 million people. So people going back to agriculture, it's really equivalent to unemployment because the land is remaining the same. All that's happening is that the per person productivity is just going down. And people are doing this essentially for their own self-respect. The second data point that I think you should be aware of is that there's been a huge increase in the number of casual workers. So what we are, it's about a 3% increase, 3 percentage point increase there. So what we are talking about is a situation where regular paid employment is diminishing and employment which are of a distressed sort, which whether in agriculture or in casual work or in very low-level self-employment, those are going up. Now, that's not a good sign at all. You want people to come off agriculture. Normally what happens is when they come off agriculture, they do go into casual work. So there would be a movement there. Then some of them would move into self-employment. But hopefully more and more of them would go into full-time paid employment.
And that's not happening.
That has actually declined.
Does the government have clarity on this? And let me explain why I ask. On the 13th, the Prime Minister, citing an RBI document, claimed that we've created 8 crore jobs in the last 3-4 years. A few days later, however, the Economic Survey said that we need to create 78.5 lakh jobs a year till 2030. Can the RBI report be correct? Because if we're actually creating 2 crore jobs a year, then creating 78 lakh jobs is not a challenge. And yet the Economic Survey called it a challenge.
It is. Well, let's go over each of these figures carefully. Firstly, when you say create jobs, you give the impression that this is something that has happened and the workers have been beneficiaries of it. We haven't created jobs. What we have done, if you listen to what I just said, is that people are working, but they are not in jobs. They're self-employed either in agriculture or in casual work. So those are not job creation, it's people doing something to survive. This is just pure survival strategies. So you're not creating. But the 80 crore figure is actually correct. So if you look at what happened, and so the period they are taking is from the pandemic crisis to now. And that's correct.
But these aren't jobs.
But these aren't jobs. These are people who need work and cannot afford to just sit around at home.
Because they're too poor.
They're too poor. So they're going out trying to do something, but you're not creating jobs.
So when
the economy is not creating
So
jobs.
when the Prime Minister or the RBI claims that these 8 crore are jobs, they're not jobs.
They're not jobs.
They're just ways of surviving
for
people who are too poor to actually be unemployed.
That's exactly right. Okay, and then let's take the second figure. The Economic Survey is saying about 8 million jobs a year, or employment opportunities a year, need to be created. That is actually, I think, an underestimate. What is being done to get that figure is that you're assuming, in effect, that the work participation of women remain exactly the same. Now, we all know that the work participation of women is very low in India. And you really want it to go up. So that alone would take it up closer to 10. And if we are talking about jobs, which is regular paid employment, you're probably talking about another couple of million to absorb the people who are currently in casual work. So we're talking about closer to 12 million. I mean, so it is a much larger challenge.
So it's not 7.8 million. It's closer to 12 million, which is 120 lakhs.
That's right.
Almost double what the Economic Survey claims.
This is correct.
Against that background, let's then come to what steps the budget has taken to try and create jobs. There was a whole slew of measures announced by the finance minister. I'll come to details in a moment's time, but let me first ask you your overall impression. If all those measures that she's talked about were to be implemented, would they make a significant difference?
Well, if we are talking about the measures that she mentioned in the context of employment, no. Those are really scratching the surface, and that too barely. There are lots of fairly impressive figures that have been trotted out, but that's not going to happen. The part that may work, which she did not talk about as a job creation effort, was the support to MSMEs. She did talk about support to MSMEs, but as a different category in itself. But if you're talking about jobs, that probably has far more impact than these palliatives that have been given in the name of job creation.
I'll come to what she said about MSMEs in a moment's time. And as she did, I'll talk about it in the context of MSMEs.
Sure.
Let's start with what you called palliatives, measures that she claimed were designed to create jobs, which you said are barely scratching the surface. And let's come to details. The government will first of all pay 1 month's wage to all young people entering the workforce, provided they are registered with the EPFO. And secondly, it will contribute 3,000 per person reimbursement to the employer for 2 years for the employer's EPFO contribution. And Mr. Sitaraman said that this will benefit 210 lakh youth. The question is this sufficient for employers to take on extra additional people? I'm not talking about replacement hiring. I'm talking about new additional people, because only the EPFO contribution is covered, the salary is uncovered. And if companies don't need people, why would they spend their profit hiring people they don't need?
This is the point. I don't think it's going to persuade. Sure, I mean, you can interpret it as a reduction in the wage rate. So if the wage rate is around, let's say, 20,000 a month, you're saying off that 20,000, so that's the cost to company, as it were. So you're saying off that 20,000, I will take away 3,000.
Which is the marginal bite.
Which is, number one, it is marginal. Number two, for what duration?
Only 2 years.
Only 2 years, right? After that, you're back to square zero. Now, the question is, now, if I take 2 years worth of 3,000, that's what? 36, 72,000, and I amortize over the lifetime of a worker, it comes to a rather ridiculous amount. Now, whether companies are going to be persuaded to do this is really questionable.
So you believe that it's very unlikely that companies will take on additional new staff. They may take on replacement staff when people retire.
They will certainly be recruiting, right? Every company recruits on a regular basis. And this is just cherry on the top. They would have recruited them anyway. The question is additionality.
That's not going to happen.
I doubt if it's going to happen.
Now
if I were employer, I wouldn't do it.
The second big scheme is the internship scheme.
Yes.
On top of a one-time payment of rupees 6,000, the government will also pay 5,000 per month per person to the top 500 companies to take interns. These companies can also charge their training costs to the CSR funds that they otherwise pay. Mr. Sitaraman estimates that 1 crore will benefit over 5 years. Now, will the top 500 companies actually take on interns? Some newspaper reports say they have to take on 4,000 each. Will they be prepared to take on that many?
This is correct. They have to take on 4,000. Well, again, let's start from first principles. Companies do take interns. Every professional institution in the country, whether it is an IIT or any engineering college, any college which is giving a degree in business administration, any ITI, any skill development formal institution, they all have internship programs. So they do internships with various companies, big and small. And the top 500, of course, are targets. And they do take interns at various levels. There's no question about it. And they've been doing it all this time. Right? So again, the question is, does this become an additionality? If it's not an additionality, then it's not having any effect.
Well, in fact, if it's not an additionality, all the government is doing is now paying these companies for what they anyway did.
For they're doing anyway.
So you're not gaining anything, they're gaining.
Yeah. So if you look at it that way, whether you look at your first proposal or the second proposal, the company is going to do exactly what it was doing last year, except it gets paid for it. So the profits of the company go up. Whether it makes a dent on employment is moot.
So again, it's unlikely that there will be an increase in the number of interns. Companies will continue to take interns as they do, but now they'll have the benefit of being paid for them.
Paid for it.
They may not be adding to the number of interns.
That is absolutely correct.
There's a second question. Do these interns actually translate into jobs, or do
Yes,
interns
they do.
remain jobs?
No.
Remain interns?
No. Why do companies take interns? So what they're doing is they're taking people who fill a requirement of the company. So they take a whole bunch of interns, and then from them they use that as a screening process to pick a subset who they will employ full time.
So some of these interns will get jobs.
Will get jobs. That's why companies do it.
But the key question is, we're still talking about interns that they anyway would be taking.
That's right.
Now they'll be paid to take them.
That's right.
Some of those interns will get jobs, but whether there's an additionality of interns coming in is very doubtful.
Is doubtful, number one. Number two, the real question that we need to ask is that in this process, would there be any skill development? So if you think of the apprenticeship scheme, which has been around for a while now, in the apprenticeship scheme, there is skill development because apprentices are taken essentially for work where you need manual training. Whether there's going to be skill development here, I don't know. So the companies could just take them and say, okay, just wander around. Just don't make a nuisance of yourself.
In which case, the purpose of skill development may not be fulfilled at all.
May not be fulfilled also.
Now, so far, we've been talking about steps that the budget proposes to try and increase formal employment.
That's right.
Either through internship or by contributing to EPFO.
That's right.
What about job creation in the informal sector? After all, the informal sector accounts for just about over 80% of all jobs in the country. But the budget is completely silent about job creation in the informal sector. Is that because it failed to do so, or because there's not much the government can do or the budget can do to encourage the informal sector?
Well, let's take that 80%. Of that 80%, 46% is in agriculture. Okay, it's 34% which is not in agriculture. Now, it would be bizarre if the government said we are going to create jobs in agriculture. That's the last thing you want, right? So we really need to look at that 34% and then ask the question that can the government create jobs there? Now, as I said, most of them are casual workers. They need work. And that work has to come from, even if it is not the organized sector or the corporate sector, but at least some kind of formal relationship between employer and employee, right? So even if we leave the corporates out, there is a whole class of micro and small enterprises who are the job creators. And that's what you need to focus on. They're the ones who are going to create jobs.
So what could the government or should the government have done to encourage these small micro companies to take on people?
Well, they have. I mean, so in the budget.
And that comes in the MSME sector.
Comes in the MSME sector.
So she's actually done things to encourage the MSME to take on jobs, but she hasn't done it under the rubric of employment.
No.
Is that because she didn't understand that this is what it would amount to? Or because
I suspect so.
That she didn't understand?
Yeah.
That is a pretty damning thing to say.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what your objectives are. If the objective of talking about employment is to fulfill aspirations, then you won't talk about the MSMEs. You would talk about the corporates.
But if the objective
is to have productive employment in the country,
MSMEs.
Let's
then at this point come to MSMEs. Once again, I'll start with the state of MSMEs before I come to what the budget has done to help them.
Yes.
Most MSMEs, or many at any rate, were driven to the ground during COVID.
Absolutely.
And several others still remain in the doldrums. So let me
No, the data is very clear.
The data is clear.
The data is there, and what it's in 2015, there were 65 million enterprises. In 23, there were 56 million.
It's come down hugely.
Yeah.
From 56 to 5.
No, from 65 to 56, and then it's crept up a little bit in the last year. All right. The MSME sector is in trouble. It's starting to recover. The point is, we need it to recover far more. We need it to go up to maybe 75, 80 million enterprises to be able to give the kind of employment that we need.
And so that audiences understand how important the MSME sector is to the Indian economy, let me cite a few figures from the economic survey of just a couple of days ago. The economic survey says that the MSMEs combined account for 35% of manufacturing, 45% of exports. I also gather that altogether they amount to totally 30% of the economy, 40, 42, 43% employment. So it's a critical part of our economy.
Absolutely.
And if they're still not reviving fast enough, that is a critical problem.
Yes.
Let's then come to what the government did to help the MSMEs. As far as I can tell, there's a credit guarantee scheme without collateral that's been offered, and Mudra loans have been enhanced from 10 lakhs to 20 lakhs. Is that sufficient?
Again, I think it's not a bad thing. It's something I've been advocating. In fact, we discussed this some time back, Karan. The credit guarantee, I think, is a good idea. This was something that was done for working capital earlier. They have extended that concept now to term loans as well. All right? Now, that is a good thing, because working capital guaranteeing working capital has a limitation, which means that you are essentially funding current operations. You are not funding expansion and growth. Financing term loans is really, guaranteeing term loans is you're financing growth. So I think that's a good step. The real question, and the question that bothers me, is that if you are doing this, why have you not extended that guarantee to the Mudra scheme? Because the Mudra scheme is about startups, whereas what is being guaranteed are for units which already exist. And there's a difference. And as I said, we need to get at least 10 to 15 million more new units coming in.
That hasn't been facilitated.
It would, well, the Mudra loan is for that purpose.
But if it is guaranteed, it would be better.
If it was guaranteed, look, the banks intensely dislike giving Mudra loans.
Because of the lack of guarantee.
Well, and it's also expensive because these are small ticket loans and the servicing cost of that loan is very high. So banks dislike it intensely. The guarantee would have helped and it wouldn't have made much of a dent in the government's pockets.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that the finance minister has taken important steps to help the MSMEs, but because, for example, the Mudra loans are not guaranteed, which they should have been, these steps are insufficient. More could have been done, should have been done.
More could have been done and should have been done, yes.
Although more hasn't been done, you still envisage that what has been done will encourage MSMEs to take on more people, even if it's just casual employment they're giving.
I am hopeful of that, but I think in order for that to happen, the government will have to sit down and have a serious talk with the banking sector.
About the loans?
About the loans.
In other words, twist their hands to make sure...
Well, you don't twist. I mean, nudge them, persuade them, tell them it's in national interest.
So, just to sum up where we've got, in terms of employment first, the actual steps done to encourage formal employment are unlikely to yield results. As you said, they're barely scratching the surface.
Yeah.
There are steps that she's taken which will encourage casual employment on the MSME side. She didn't include them under the rubric of increasing employment. They come under the MSME side, but nonetheless, they will increase casual employment.
Yes.
However, even when it comes to the MSME side, there's more she could have done to help them, which she hasn't done, and that more would have been guaranteeing the Mudra loans.
That would have helped a lot because what she has done is for units which already exist. She'd done it first by guaranteeing working capital loans. Now she's helped it further, helped the growth by guaranteeing term loans. But for startups,
There's nothing there.
there's nothing there.
And we need those startups.
We need those startups desperately.
The paradox is that where she has ended up encouraging employment, be it only casual employment, is an area where she didn't realize she was doing it because she hasn't focused on it under the rubric of employment. It's a fortuitous, happy outcome of what she's doing.
It is a happy outcome. And yeah, I'm quite surprised. I mean, this should have been obvious. In fact, I would have started with this and then gone on to the corporate sector. I would have reversed the
So this
order.
is in fact also a comment on the quality of advisors she has around her who didn't point out to her, Madam, what you're doing for MSMEs is really where you will be increasing employment. Please shove it under the rubric of employment.
Well, I wouldn't want to pass comments on her advisors.
Okay. Are there other steps that she could have taken, or maybe I should say that she should have taken, that would have better encouraged employment in the formal sector? That's where she's barely scratched the surface. Are there better things she could have done that would have made a bigger difference?
You see, the point is, as far as the formal sector is concerned, one of the things we have to recognize is that corporate India is becoming more and more capital intensive by the day. So the kind of technologies that are being adopted are really labor replacing technologies. So the question that we should be asking ourselves, why is this happening? Are we in a situation where labor is overpriced and or capital is underpriced, so that companies have an incentive to use more capital than labor?
What's your answer to your question?
I think capital is underpriced.
Taxing it more?
No. Changing the interest rate structure.
Increase interest
At
rates?
the moment, if you look at the yield curve, which is the interest rate which from short-term loans, let's say 90-day loans, to let's say 20-year loans. So different interest rates, and that's called the yield curve. Today, the difference between the interest rate on a 90-day loan and let's say a 10-year loan is only 0.8%.
It should be a lot more.
It should be closer to 2.5%.
That would make capital more expensive and people therefore more willing to take on labor.
What you've done now, because remember, 90-day loans are working capital loans. That is what companies take to pay their workers.
Those should be cheaper.
Those should be cheaper. So you should bring that, the lower end down and the upper end up.
Could she have played around with interest rates in the way you're suggesting?
Of course.
And
this is entirely within the provenance of the finance ministry.
And she failed to do so?
I don't think it even cropped up.
You mean it didn't even occur to her?
It doesn't seem to be. I couldn't find it in the economic survey. I don't know. I missed it.
This is the flip side of what we talked about, casual employment increasing through MSMEs.
That's right.
She didn't realize it was going to happen, but it's a happy outcome that it will.
Happy outcome.
This is something she could have done, but it never occurred to her to do it.
Yes. And the interesting part of it is that when we think of interest rates, we think of the Reserve Bank, right? It's the Reserve Bank which drives monetary policy and so on. But the fact of the matter is that the yield curve, which is the structure of interest rates, is entirely the domain of the finance ministry.
And so there were things she could have done that would have more successfully encouraged the formal sector to consider increasing employment, which
using less capital, which means you could have released more capital for growth in the economy.
And that didn't occur to her to do?
I don't know.
Well, I'll pause there for a moment and let it sink into the audience. Because where she succeeded in creating casual employment in the MSME sector, she didn't realize it's a happy outcome. Where she could have acted to encourage the formal sector to take on more people, it didn't occur to her to do it.
Yeah.
That is a very interesting comment on the ability of our finance minister and certainly on her thinking and her understanding of the economy. But I'll leave it there. I won't go further. Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Let me come instead to the second challenge facing the economy, which in a sense the budget also tried to tackle. First of all, let's talk about the challenge. It's private sector investment. As The Economist magazine said in January, it has been sluggish during Mr. Modi's time in office right through the 10 years he's been there.
That's correct.
And even the economic survey, which says that companies are swimming in excess profits, admits that they are reluctant to invest because consumption and demand are low.
This is correct.
So let me begin by asking you, how serious is the situation with regard to private sector investment?
It's a serious problem. You know, Karan, in any strongly growing economy, what you should expect is a very close relationship between GDP growth and consumption growth. We've historically, again, particularly in the high growth periods post 91, we've always had a situation where consumption growth would be somewhere between half a percentage point to a max 1 percentage point below the growth rate of GDP. At the moment, it is 4 percentage points below. That's a huge gap. So what you're getting is GDP growing at 7.8% or whatever it is. You've got consumption growing at only 4%, right? Now, the point is that this is not sustainable, because ultimately whatever is produced has to be consumed or invested.
And you don't have the demand to consume
You don't
it.
have the demand to do it. So sooner or later, in fact, we are there now. So if you look at what's happening to corporate balance sheets, right, the top line growth has slowed down dramatically.
Because they can't sell.
There isn't a demand is not growing fast enough.
Has she taken any effective set of measures to improve consumption and demand? I imagine she's hoping that whenever her steps to increase employment yield results, demand and consumption will automatically improve. But since her steps to improve employment are unlikely to yield results, the impact on consumption and demand is unlikely to be great.
Well, as I said, that's not necessarily true. If the MSME sector does revive and they start generating employment and therefore incomes, yes, consumption will revive.
Once again, a sector she didn't realize could create employment will also be the sector that improves demand and consumption.
Because employment and consumption are totally linked. They're very closely linked.
But she should have been focusing more on improving demand and consumption.
Yes.
And she hasn't done that.
Not really.
What she has done is to announce a series of steps that she believes, and I'm underlining the word she believes, could improve and boost private sector investment. The angel tax has been abolished.
Which is, I think, a good thing, by the way.
Tax on foreign companies has been reduced from 40 to 35%. Government capex, as announced in the interim budget, will be 11.11 lakh crore, which is 3.4% of GDP. And then there's 1.48 lakh crore to be spent on education, employment and skilling, 1.52 lakh crore on agriculture and allied services, and 2.66 lakh crore for rural development. And side by side, the government is also committed to building 3 crore houses over, I imagine, a 5-year period. Will all of this collectively revive and encourage private investment?
Well, this is the traditional economist's prescription for reviving demand, which is public investment should go up. She has done that. The government has increased public investment. The problem is private investment is not responding.
And hasn't been for a while.
And hasn't been for a while. And the question the government needs to ask is why not? What is it that's holding up private investment? That is the question that has to be asked first, and then depending upon the answer, you'd formulate policies.
Is the answer lack of demand, lack of consumption?
The answer is not clear. It can range from many things. So far as, again, let's split the economy up into corporates and the MSMEs. As far as the MSME is concerned, their problems were different. Their problem is that they were hammered. They had a lot of them had closed down. They were not getting bank loans. They were in trouble. So you couldn't expect any investment growth from them. The corporates, on the other hand, had the funds. They had the markets available to them. they could invest, and they did invest, not that they didn't invest. So if you look at the corporate numbers, you have a situation where despite very strong top-line growth, the capacity utilization continues to hang around 75%. So it's not that they're not investing, but they're investing just enough rather than going the whole hog. So the question is, why not?
What's your answer?
And my answer is, they do not have confidence that the demand will sustain long enough for them to recoup their investments. So they are making investments for the demand they see. So to give credible evidence that demand will grow more strongly in the
So
future.
they're only investing for 4% increases in
4
demand.
to 4 and 5%, yeah.
Not
that's
the
exactly
7 and
what they're doing.
8%.
Not the 7 or 8% that we need.
Tell me, how much of an impact on demand and consumption will what she's done for the MSMEs have? As you said, they will now be encouraged to take on more casual labor. They've got better guarantees, although the Mudra loans are not guaranteed. How much of an impact will improvement on the MSME sector have on consumption and demand in the economy as a whole?
I don't know. I really don't know. A lot depends on how the banks work. What she's done for the MSME sector, I think, is not bad at all. It's really quite good. Mudra would have helped. The point is that she should recognize that the banking sector isn't enamored of giving MSMEs, of giving loans to MSMEs. Right? They do it kicking and screaming because they have to meet the requirements that the RBI sets on them for priority sector lending. And even there, they fudge by actually just giving more money to favored MSMEs. That is, MSMEs who've been with them for a long time and have a track record, rather than creating new activities. So really, the attitude of the bankers is going to really drive the success of these programs.
So the extent to which whatever she's done for the MSME sector actually improves consumption and demand depends upon how bankers respond to MSMEs.
Yeah, to MSMEs and these guarantees that are being provided.
Can the RBI lean on bankers to ensure that they respond adequately, or is that unlikely?
I'm not sure. I'm sure they can. The RBI does have.
But will they?
The question is, will they? And what kind of monitoring would they be able to do to be able to do so?
So we have a very interesting situation, and I'm pausing deliberately to take stock because I think it's important for the audience. What she's done in terms of formal sector employment is barely scratching the surface. It's going to be pretty close to negligible. There will be an impact on casual employment because of the MSMEs. But how much depends upon how bankers respond to the MSMEs.
That's right.
That in turn can be determined by the RBI. They have the power, but will they exercise that power?
Yes.
And so there are a whole series of question marks over whether this budget will actually be successful in tackling the problems that it's recognized.
This is true of all budgets. There are always question marks because the budget is only a financing provision, right? There is a whole institutional setup that needs to make any budget effective. The real question, I think, that we should be asking, are these institutions up to it?
And what's your answer?
I don't know. I frankly don't know.
So that's another question mark.
Yes. Because institutions are no longer the institutions I used to.
So insofar as employment is one of the critical problems facing the country, and I'll say it's particularly worrying to the audience because it affects ordinary people who want jobs and can't get them and therefore continue to languish in deprivation and poverty. Insofar as employment is concerned, there won't be a really meaningful difference in terms of formal employment, probably no difference at all. There will be some difference in terms of casual employment, but how much depends upon the attitude of banks. And so the problem of unemployment is not really going to be ameliorated very much. A little bit on the casual side, but that's about it.
It could be a lot for all we know.
depending upon banks.
Everything depends upon how the system works.
So we just don't know what the impact on employment will be and how successful it will be.
Yeah, because there are no verities that we can go by. There were at one time.
In other words, we have to hope that the system, i.e. the banks, respond adequately
Yes.
to the needs and concerns of MSMEs. And if only she'd guaranteed the Mudra loans, it would have helped hugely.
I think it would have helped.
Finally, let's come to what the finance minister has called next generation reforms. They were part of her 9 priorities. She's promised a comprehensive review of income tax, simplification of GST, an economic policy framework, capital and entrepreneurship related reforms, simplification of FDI and overseas investment, and better ease of doing business. But do you get the feeling that all of these are promises for the future? They're not actual deliverables.
Well, frankly, there is, in that list you just read out, there's nothing that I haven't heard before.
So this is old wine being repeated.
Yeah, so are these next-gen reforms? Because these are essentially issues that have been discussed right since this government started. Now, I couldn't find anything new in it.
So the very terminology is slightly mistaken, because if you've been discussing these reforms for 10 years, they can hardly be next generation reforms.
That's right. I mean, sure, I mean, look, I mean, you had the land reforms, the agricultural reforms. These were the next-gen reforms.
And they didn't happen.
They're nowhere in that list.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about this list is it's a list of promises of what she'll do. Some in 6 months, some in 2 years, some longer, but they're not actually things she's done. They're only promises to do.
This is right, yeah.
I've come right to the end of this interview, and I've deliberately left my last question to the end. Now I think it's time to ask it. What is your overall impression of the budget as a whole? I've got an idea what you think in terms of what she's done about employment, what she's done about private investment, what she's done about MSMEs, and where in all 3 areas what she's done is insufficient and she should and could have done more. But what's your overall impression of the budget as a whole?
It's a nondescript budget.
Nondescript. Why do you say that?
Because there's nothing there which identifies an issue and works towards solving it or addressing it. So you have that list. And as I said, some of that list are issues which need to be addressed. Some of them are just catchphrases. But it's a nondescript budget in the sense that it's not significantly different from what we've seen in the immediate past. The one good thing, I think, which I compliment the finance minister for, is that she is sticking to the path of fiscal rectitude. I think that's desirable and it should be done. Whether or not, and she's getting a lot of accolades for increasing capital expenditure of the government significantly. Now, whether the kind of capital expenditure that are being made are the kinds we need is, again, a moot question. And but let's give her credit for that. This was true of last year's budget as well, both of the points.
2 very interesting things emerge out of what you've said about the budget. There's not very much there that identifies the problem, and there isn't very much there that seeks to identify the solution. Does that suggest that not enough analytical thinking has gone into it?
You know, this is the thing. Budget making is a process which is so intense you don't have time for analytical thinking. The finance ministry doesn't have time for that. This is the job of the line ministries.
And they haven't
And
done
the
it.
analytical thinking happens over it. It takes 3-4 years to be able to figure out in your particular area what the nature of the problem is.
And you're saying that hasn't been happening.
I see no evidence. I'm sure it's happening. Ministries
no
do
evidence
this
of
all
it.
the time.
But
there's
there's-
no evidence of it in the budget. So that, are we in a situation where the ministry's analysis is not being effectively conveyed? And I suspect that's what's happening. There's just too little time to do that.
The second conclusion that emerges from what you said, when you call this a nondescript budget, is that it's not really the budget the country needed when it faces such critical economic problems.
No, I don't think it is.
In other words, it's failed us.
Well, not entirely. As I said, there are bright spots in it. And as of now, we can only wait and hope.
But
It could turn out to be brilliant.
it's not the budget the country needed.
I think what the country needed was, as I said, the budget itself is nondescript. So it's not a bad budget, right? But neither is it a good budget. What the country needed was, I think, a clear articulation of what is the nature of the problem, what is it that we need to address and face up to upfront. That is not articulated. And unless you articulate the problems and the issues, it's unlikely that you will be able to address them.
Tell me this, when a budget fails to articulate the problems and therefore fails to articulate the solutions, does it suggest that the government hasn't fully recognized those problems? Is that why it's not articulated?
Well-
or is it in denial?
No, this is the thing, that if you look at the overall macroeconomic data, they look very good. Now, if the government says that, look, these numbers are fantastic, and we don't really need to do anything, then what you will get is business as usual.
But if you look under the bonnet of the
But
car,
the point is, if you looked at simply one data point, which is what's happening to consumption, and then start asking the question, why is consumption low? Because income growth among the poorer sections of society are low. Why are they low? Because they don't have jobs. Why aren't there jobs? It's because the MSMEs are dead. A whole string of issues emerges from that one single data point.
but that isn't happening.
That's the question I'm asking.
That process of
It may have well
analytic-
happened, because if you look at what I said, much of it is reflected in those 9 points that you brought up.
In a sense,
I
what-
do not know.
In a sense, what you're saying echoes what Ratin Roy said in a very recent article for the Business Standard. He said the Indian economy is like a car. While it's running and you're sitting in the car, it seems the macro features are all fine, it's tickety-boo. Open the bonnet and you suddenly discover there are a whole lot of serious problems,
Absolutely.
but while the bonnet is shut, you aren't aware of them. When you open the bonnet, you can't miss them. And much the same is true of what the government's done. It's gone by the macro reality, which seems okay. But when you dig deeper, as you did, you suddenly discover
Well,
that
I said even from the macro, just that 4% growth of consumption should have been ringing alarm bells.
and the fact that it didn't is deeply worrying, isn't it?
Nobody even talks about it.
But that's what I mean. It's deeply worrying that the finance minister, the finance ministry, all her advisors haven't had alarm bells ringing just because of that 1.4% gap in consumption versus GDP.
Okay.
That leads me to the conclusion that their expertise must be lacking.
I have no reason to believe so. I don't think there's any change in the expertise within the bureaucracy.
So then this is denial.
It could well be.
It could well be. My very last question, and in a way it's very apt now. The finance minister began her speech by saying that globally the world faced uncertainties, but India, she said, was a shining exception. Is India really a shining exception?
In one sense, yes. In another sense, no. We recovered from the crisis very rapidly. And again, I may be parroting. What really saved our economy was the speed at which consumption bounced back after being severely compressed during 2021. And it was that consumption demand that gave rise to this very rapid recovery. To give the government credit, they increased government expenditures significantly, but they didn't go overboard with the fiscal deficit as a lot of other countries did. I think that was very sensible. The timing was good. So we did certain things right. And in a sense, our recovery was excellent. The problem comes after that. The problem comes really in 21-22, when we didn't have a national lockdown. When the pandemic was going across the country, different states were locking down at different points in time. And that was what affected the MSMEs really, really badly. There was no succor from the government at all. They were just left to their own devices. That was when the problem began. So I think we have...
And after that problem began, failure to tackle it has compounded it.
Well, failure to recognize it was, because the corporate sector came back very quickly and filled up a lot of those gaps.
And the MSME sector did not.
Did not.
And that was not recognized.
That was not recognized. Whose cost we are paying today.
And this is why we have that 4% gap between consumption and GDP.
And GDP growth.
And this is why the failure of the government to recognize and respond to it is deeply distressing, because it means that the problems of the economy are not being tackled.
At the moment.
At the moment.
Let us hope they are.
Which is why you say this is not really the budget we needed.
Yeah.
Professor Sen, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.